It began without a declaration. No drums, no speeches, just silence. The kind that hides danger. At 2:17 a.m., somewhere along the French coast, an enemy convoy rode through the mist. Engines low, headlights dimmed, soldiers half asleep. They didn't know that a British submarine, miles away and completely still, had been tracking their every move. But this wasn't an ambush. No torpedoes were fired, no flares went up. Because Britain wasn't preparing to fight, it was preparing to fool. For centuries, Britain had survived wars through courage and will, but this was different. This time, they faced a superpower that had crushed half of Europe in less than a year, a nation that called itself invincible. Its armies were larger, its machines stronger, its leaders ruthless. And yet, it would be undone not by force, but by the one weapon it never understood: deception. In London, beneath an unmarked building near Whitehall, a small team worked in secret. Their battlefield wasn't made of mud or metal. It was made of information. Every signal intercepted, every map altered, every rumor planted. A new kind of warfare was being born. The generals called them dreamers. The press never knew their names. But these men and women would soon turn Britain's greatest weakness, its lack of strength, into its most powerful advantage. Their mission was clear but impossible. Convince the enemy that what they see isn't real. Make them move before Britain fires a single shot. Outthink a superpower. What followed would change military history forever. A war fought not with armies, but with illusions. Ships that didn't exist, armies that never marched, plans that were never written. And yet, every one of them changed the outcome of real battles. And yet, every one of them changed the outcome of real battles. The world would remember the victories, but few would ever know the truth behind them, that Britain's greatest triumphs were born in the shadows. This is the untold story of how an island nation, cornered and outnumbered, defeated a superpower, not with strength, but with rare tactics the world had never seen before.
By 1940, Britain stood on the edge of extinction. Across the Channel, Europe had fallen like dominoes under the boots of a single, unstoppable force, Nazi Germany. Its armies were vast, efficient, and merciless. Its machines rolled like thunder across the continent. In less than a year, France had been crushed, Poland erased, Norway and the Netherlands taken without mercy. Every nation that resisted had been silenced. For the first time in modern history, Britain was completely alone. No allies within reach, no land to retreat to, just the sea, that narrow stretch of water between Dover and Calais, standing between freedom and annihilation. In Berlin, Hitler's generals called it inevitable. They named it Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of the British Isles. On paper, it was flawless. The Luftwaffe controlled the skies. The Wehrmacht had millions ready to cross the Channel. The British Army, after the disaster at Dunkirk, barely had enough rifles to arm its men. Even the Prime Minister admitted privately, "If they come, we can only fight with what we have." Every day, German bombers appeared over London, dropping steel and fire onto the heart of the empire. Cities burned. Children were evacuated to the countryside. Yet, Britain refused to surrender. But courage alone wouldn't win a war against a machine. The German command had one fatal weakness: certainty. They believed Britain's defeat was only a matter of time. Their maps already marked victory. Their officers boasted of tea in London by Christmas. They trusted their strength so blindly that they never imagined they could be deceived. Inside the War Office, a different kind of soldier began to emerge. Men of mathematics, linguistics, and logic. Spies who never carried guns, only briefcases. Spies who never carried guns, only briefcases. They understood something the generals didn't. If the enemy couldn't be stopped, perhaps it could be confused. From those quiet rooms, a new kind of warfare was born, invisible, intelligent, and utterly British. The plan was simple. If you can't overpower the enemy, outsmart him.
They were not soldiers. They were thinkers, quiet men and women who fought wars with pencils, not pistols. They worked in rooms without windows, under names that history almost forgot. And yet, their ideas would shape the fate of nations. When Britain realized it couldn't defeat the enemy by strength, it turned to the one thing it had always possessed: imagination. In the depths of London's secret offices, a team was formed under the cover name the 20 Committee. Its mission was unlike any other: to deceive a superpower so completely that it wouldn't even know it was being fooled. At the heart of it stood Colonel John Bevan, a strategist with the calm precision of a chess master. He believed wars were not won by who fired first, but who thought last. Beside him was Ewan Montague, a naval intelligence officer with a flair for the theatrical. He could turn a corpse, a forged letter, and a typewriter into weapons more lethal than bullets. And working behind them all, hidden in the countryside, was a group of mathematicians led by the brilliant Alan Turing, whose machines could read the enemy's secrets before the enemy even acted. They called themselves the Quiet Army. No uniforms, no medals, no battlefield. Only logic, deception, and time. Their job was to make the enemy believe what Britain wanted them to believe. They forged fake battle orders, created phantom divisions that never existed, and sent double agents to feed half-truths that would twist into full disasters for the enemy. It was the birth of a new kind of warfare: psychological, invisible, and utterly human. Even Churchill, when briefed about these operations, simply nodded and said, "In war, truth must always be protected by a bodyguard of lies." In bunkers filled with cigarette smoke and coded cables, these architects of deception turned confusion into an art form. They weren't fighting for glory. They were fighting for time. Time for Britain to rebuild, for the tides to turn, for hope to survive. And soon, their invisible war would begin to rewrite the visible one. Every great strategy began as a gamble, and Britain's first deception was nothing less than that: a gamble against a superpower's intelligence machine. The year was 1941. The Luftwaffe still rained fire over British cities, and Hitler's army was preparing its next move, an invasion of North Africa. Britain knew it couldn't match the enemy in numbers. But what if the enemy could be made to fight the wrong battle? Colonel John Bevan's team decided to try something no one had ever done: create an army that didn't exist. A complete formation, with its own insignias, fake officers, forged documents, and wireless chatter. It would be called the 1st British Armored Division, and it would exist only in the imagination of the enemy. In an abandoned warehouse outside London, radio operators began sending out coded transmissions. Trucks with painted insignias moved through the countryside only at night. Engineers built wooden tanks and dummy artillery to leave on airfields where German reconnaissance planes could discover them. The goal was simple: make the Germans believe Britain was massing for an invasion in Greece, while the real attack would strike somewhere else entirely. Even within British command, few knew about the operation. One wrong whisper, one loose report, and the entire illusion would collapse. But the gamble paid off. German intelligence intercepted the fake signals and completely believed the story.
Their maps began to fill with phantom divisions. They shifted real troops to defend the wrong coast. And when British forces finally launched their true offensive in North Africa, the enemy was caught off balance, unprepared, and exposed. It wasn't just a victory of movement, it was a victory of mind. For the first time, Britain had proved that deception could save lives, change battles, and turn weakness into strength. After the success, Bevans simply wrote in his report, "The enemy trusts its own intelligence. That is our greatest weapon." The first experiment had worked, but it was only the beginning. What came next would turn illusion into an entire system of warfare, and Britain would perfect it in the shadows.
After the first success, deception stopped being an experiment. It became an operation. One so vast, so secret, that even most generals fighting the war didn't know it existed. It became an operation. One so vast, so secret, that even most generals fighting the war didn't know it existed. It was called Operation of Shadows, a code name whispered only behind closed doors. Its goal was simple: control what the enemy believed. If Germany thought Britain was weak, Britain would appear invincible. If they expected an invasion in the north, Britain would strike from the south. The battlefield was no longer made of land, it was made of lies. From bunkers in London to radio huts in Cairo, hundreds of officers became actors in a play the enemy would never see. Wireless stations filled the air with fabricated transmissions. Maps were forged, orders rewritten, and letters lost deliberately so German spies could find them. Even double agents, real people with fake loyalties, began feeding misinformation that traveled straight into Hitler's war room. One such agent, codenamed Garbo, created an entire network of imaginary subagents, reporting false movements, fake landings, and phantom units. German intelligence rewarded him handsomely, believing every word. They had no idea Garbo was a British asset, their most trusted liar. The brilliance of Operation of Shadows was that it didn't just fool the enemy, it made them paranoid. Every time German officers planned an attack, they hesitated. Every time they received intelligence, they questioned if it was real. The machine that once moved with absolute certainty now began to doubt itself. Inside the British War Office, analysts started to see a pattern. German troop movements no longer matched logic. Entire divisions were being sent to protect coasts that Britain had no interest in attacking. The deception was working, not just tactically, but psychologically. It was the perfect crime of war: invisible, silent, and devastatingly effective. And behind it all were minds that understood a simple truth. Sometimes, the most powerful weapon is belief itself. As one officer later wrote, "We no longer fought the Germans. We made them fight themselves." But the illusion couldn't last forever. Because soon, Britain would attempt its boldest deception yet, one that would decide the fate of the entire war.
By 1944, the war had reached its most dangerous balance. The Allies were preparing for the greatest invasion in modern history, D-Day, the liberation of Europe. But success depended on one impossible condition: the enemy must not know where the invasion would strike. If the Germans guessed right, the beaches of Normandy would turn into a graveyard before the first British ship even landed. So, the architects of deception planned their most daring illusion yet, an operation that would rewrite warfare itself. Its codename was Operation Fortitude. The plan was breathtaking in scale. Britain would convince Germany that the invasion was coming, not in Normandy, but in Pas-de-Calais, 200 miles away. To do that, they would build an entire fake army, tanks made of rubber, planes made of plywood, and soldiers that existed only on paper. Even the commander would be a legend, General George S. Patton, the man Germans feared most, chosen to lead this phantom force. Airfields were filled with dummy aircraft. Trucks drove in circles to create tire marks visible from the sky. Radio operators transmitted endless fake chatter about fuel shortages, training drills, and troop deployments. Every detail was crafted for the enemy's eyes. And the enemy believed it. Intercepted German messages confirmed they were moving entire divisions north to Calais, waiting for an attack that would never come. When D-Day finally began in Normandy, the Germans hesitated, convinced it was only a diversion. That hesitation, just a few precious hours, changed history. From the cliffs of Dover, British observers watched ships disappear into the mist, knowing that the greatest lie of the war was about to save thousands of lives. One officer later wrote, "It wasn't courage that won the beaches, it was illusion." Operation Fortitude was the turning point. The moment Britain proved that a well-placed lie could defeat an empire built on fear. The superpower had been blinded by its own arrogance, and Britain had learned to fight in the shadows and win.
When the invasion of Normandy began on June 6, 1944, the German High Command didn't panic. They waited. In their minds, this couldn't be the real attack. All their reports, all their intercepted messages, all their trusted agents said the same thing. The main invasion will come at Calais. So, when thousands of Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy, Berlin refused to believe it. They thought it was a trick, a diversion to draw their forces away from the real battlefield. For 48 critical hours, Hitler held back his Panzer divisions, his most powerful armored units, waiting for an attack that never came. By the time he realized the truth, it was too late. The Allies had already broken through. The beachheads were secure, the momentum irreversible. The deception had worked so perfectly that it didn't just delay Germany's response, it paralyzed it. Inside Hitler's bunker, the atmosphere turned chaotic. Officers shouted conflicting reports, radio intercepts contradicted each other, and no one could tell what was real anymore. Even trusted intelligence officers began to question their own data. The once flawless German machine, built on precision and discipline, had been turned against itself. One captured officer later admitted, "We had so many sources, we stopped believing any of them." That was Britain's true victory, not on the beaches, but in the minds of its enemies. The deception had infected their confidence like a virus. The fear of being tricked became stronger than the fear of losing. The deception had infected their confidence like a virus. The fear of being tricked became stronger than the fear of losing. Meanwhile, in London, the architects of Operation Fortitude watched the reports come in with silent satisfaction. There was no celebration, no applause, only a quiet understanding that their invisible war had changed the course of history. The Germans continued to guard Calais for weeks, expecting another invasion that never arrived. Tens of thousands of soldiers, tanks, and planes stayed idle, while Normandy became the doorway to Europe's liberation. A war once ruled by weapons had been rewritten by whispers. And for the first time, the world saw that intelligence could do what armies could not: make power doubt itself. Deep beneath the streets of London, in a maze of concrete tunnels known only by a number, the real war was being fought. Not with rifles or bayonets, but with maps, signals, and silence. This was the British brain room, the heart of the deception campaign, where 1,000 thoughts could weigh more than 1,000 bullets. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the hum of typewriters. Every wall was covered in maps marked with red strings, pins, and handwritten notes.
Radio operators sat shoulder to shoulder, their headphones crackling with intercepted German transmissions. Each coded message that arrived could mean life or death from men hundreds of miles away. At the far end of the room stood Colonel John Bevan, calm as ever, watching the chaos like a conductor leading an invisible orchestra. Every report that crossed his desk had to fit the illusion perfectly. If even one false signal contradicted another, the enemy might notice, and years of planning would collapse in seconds. They were mathematicians translating logic into deception, linguists forging letters in fluent German, artists sketching fake maps, and secretaries typing fake orders that would one day end up in the hands of the enemy. Each person knew only a fragment of the truth. No one saw the full picture. That was how the brain room protected itself. Sometimes the pressure was unbearable. People worked 3 days without sleep, their minds running faster than the machines they used. Every mistake had a body count. And yet no one complained. They understood that this hidden war, this silent architecture of illusion, was keeping Britain alive. At night, when the last lights dimmed, Bevan would look over the endless rows of papers and whisper, "We are not lying to deceive. We are lying to survive." History would never record their faces. There would be no medals, no parades, no victory marches for them. But inside that underground room, Britain was rewriting the rules of warfare, proving that sometimes the sharpest blade in war is the mind itself.
When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the world cheered for victory. Crowds filled the streets of London, waving flags, singing songs, and celebrating the end of years of darkness. But while the world looked up at the fireworks, deep beneath the city, another kind of silence filled the British brain room. The war they had fought had no battlefield to return from, no medals to collect, no graves to visit. Their victories existed only in documents stamped, classified. Their heroes had no faces, only code names. Colonel John Bevan received a single telegram that day. It read, "Operation complete. Proceed to closure." He placed it on his desk and simply said, "Then the illusion is over." It was strange to win a war the world would never know they fought. The newspapers credited generals and divisions, tanks and airstrikes. They spoke of courage, of sacrifice, of visible glory, but not of deception, not of the invisible war that made those victories possible. The Germans never fully understood what had happened. Even after surrender, their officers insisted that the Normandy invasion had been a diversion. One captured general told his interrogators, "You British are mad. You created an army out of thin air, and we believed it." Bevan only smiled when he read the transcript. That was his reward. In time, the secret files of Operation Fortitude were locked away. For years, not even Parliament knew the scale of what had been done. Many of those who designed it returned quietly to civilian life, their work buried in archives no one would open for decades. But their influence had already spread in the doctrines of modern warfare, in intelligence training, in every army that learned the value of misdirection. Their war left no monuments, but its shadow fell long across history. Because every victory that followed, from Korea to the Cold War, carried a piece of their lesson, that the strongest weapon on any battlefield isn't fear, fire, or fury. It's the ability to make the enemy believe a lie and call it truth.
History remembers battles by their noise, the roar of guns, the thunder of engines, the cheers of victory. But some wars are won in silence. The war that Britain fought in the shadows was one of them. When peace returned, the soldiers went home, and the cities began to heal. But those who had fought with deception, those who had turned imagination into a weapon, disappeared quietly into civilian life. There were no parades for them. Their stories weren't printed in textbooks or etched on memorials. Their victories lived only in secret archives, locked behind metal doors for decades. Years later, when those files were finally declassified, the truth astonished historians. They discovered that Britain, small, exhausted, nearly broken, had beaten a superpower not through strength, but through strategy, intelligence, and belief. They learned how entire armies had been redirected, how false radio networks and wooden tanks had shifted the tide of history. They saw that behind every famous general's success stood a handful of anonymous minds who had written victory in invisible ink. One intelligence officer once said, "Our job was to make lies look like facts, and facts look like lies, until the war forgot which was which." And perhaps that was Britain's true genius, not in outshooting the enemy, but in outthinking him. The legacy of that invisible war continues even today. Modern warfare, cyber intelligence, misinformation campaigns, strategic communications, all trace their origins back to those dark rooms under London. What began as survival became science. What started as deception became doctrine. But beyond tactics, there lies a deeper truth. That victory isn't always about power, it's about understanding, about knowing your enemy better than he knows himself, and sometimes about having the courage to trust silence more than noise. The British deception campaigns changed the very definition of war. They proved that intelligence could stand where armies could not, that in the face of overwhelming might, the human mind was still the sharpest weapon ever made. When asked years later what he felt about it all, Colonel John Bevan simply said, "We didn't win because we were stronger. We won because we were clever enough to seem stronger." And perhaps in that single line lies the spirit of an entire nation. A small island that stood alone against an empire and won, not by fighting harder, but by thinking smarter. If you enjoyed this story of Britain's hidden war, the war fought not with bullets but with the mind, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel for more untold stories from the past, and share it with those who still believe that history is written only by armies, because sometimes the greatest victories are the ones the world never sees. The greatest victories are the ones the world never sees.